Hi there, I'm Jonathan Westerling, Manager of Special Programs for Google SAS, and I am your host for this week's SAS Office Hours. Welcome to today's session. I'll remind you that we are here every Friday morning at 10 o'clock for an office hours and Q&A. So whether you're here to learn something new about SAS or ask some questions during the Q&A session afterwards, we welcome you on board for today's session, and thank you for being a Google SAS customer. Today we'll be reviewing some recent changes to the Google SAS, some improvements, some new features. These are the heartbeat interval change, the change in batch size, and also introducing grant reservations. Our agenda here is to take a look at the CBSD reliability changes for heartbeats. And then, as I mentioned, batch size, and then these grant reservations. You can use the chat in YouTube here to post questions anytime during the presentation. And I will, after we go through the features, leave the door open, as it will, the virtual door, for a Q&A for any questions you may have about Google SAS. You can follow up anytime by email, any time of the week. If you miss out on a Friday morning, you can always email us, sas-support@google.com. So let's talk about these changes to improve CBSD reliability. And those changes are that we're increasing the frequency of heartbeats. We're reducing the heartbeat interval to increase the frequency of heartbeats with the SAS. The second thing is we're limiting the single batch size that we're processing. And the third thing is we're introducing a concept called grant reservations. So I want to dive into all three of these and give you more detail about what this involves. So the heartbeat interval is something that may not be, you may not be aware of if you're a SAS customer. If you're an equipment vendor, if you're someone who's working with us to manufacture equipment, then this is probably something you are aware of, and you probably got an email from us outlining what this change is. But I want to run through it in detail for everyone, whether you're a customer or a vendor, so that you can understand what's going on here behind the scenes, because it's kind of important. And this is what's called the recommended heartbeat interval. So the recommended heartbeat interval used to be 200 seconds, and now it's 60 seconds. So this is a value that the SAS provides to the CBSDs, telling them when they should heartbeat, how often, how frequent they should heartbeat. Previously, we were 200 seconds, and now we've changed that to 60 seconds. The reason we did this is it makes CBSDs more resilient to temporary network issues or delays. So we were seeing situations where some CBSDs who were connectivity challenged, even for a moment, when we set that heartbeat interval to 200 seconds, it wasn't giving them enough time to do things like reestablish the heartbeat or switch to another channel if they'd been suspended. So we took a really deep look at this and decided the best thing to do was to decrease the heartbeat interval that we recommend to CBSDs. Now, I'll mention this is an optional guidance from the SAS. So there's not, the CBSDs are free to legally, or according to the spec, do whatever they want to do. However, we as Google SAS have decided that we would like to recommend that those devices, those CBSDs, change from using a 200-second to a 60-second heartbeat interval. And as I mentioned, it gives them more time to figure things out if there's a temporary network issue. So let's take a deeper look even at what's going on here with this graphic. Here you can see the typical heartbeat interval as we've now proposed it. So the heartbeat interval, the heartbeat begins here, the new transmit time, and ends 4 minutes later. Sorry about the big black let's see. I don't know why you're seeing that. Anyway, moving along, for 4 minutes later, the grant expires, and then there's a grace period afterwards. So there's a 5-minute period of transmissions. So that means that previously 200 seconds went by, and we were about here in terms of that transmit expire time. So previously, the transmit expire time 200 seconds would elapse, and we'd be here, and we'd have a limited amount of time to fix any issues that came up before that transmit expire time expired. And we have that 1-minute grace period, but technically the transmit expire time happens here, and the grant has to go back into a granted mode instead of an authorized mode. So by having the 200 seconds in our heartbeat interval, we were encouraging people to wait kind of until the last minute to deal with any issues that came up. So now here's what we have. This graphic shows you the current situation. After 60 seconds, we encourage the device, the CBSD, to heartbeat again. And the retry interval is actually 30 seconds. So if that first 60-second heartbeat doesn't go through due to a network issue, there's 5 additional opportunities with the 30-second retry interval for that heartbeat to work out before we even hit the end of the transmit expire time. Never mind the grace period. So what we're doing is we're essentially making sure that if your device, if your CBSD has an issue, we got plenty of time to figure out and get past that network problem before we get into a period where the grant expires, or worst case scenario, that grace period expires and the transmitter has to turn off. So we did take a good hard look at this, and this is what we decided was a great opportunity to improve the resiliency of CBSDs in situations where the network is having problems. So again, for customers, this probably isn't something that's going to impact you, and it's probably not even something that you can configure. But we wanted you to be aware of this change. And you can certainly check with your equipment vendor to see if your CBSDs are using this new recommendation. We've also published a new test plan for equipment vendors that helps them check the compatibility. So if you have any, if they have any concerns, they can contact us, or they can run through that test plan that we put together to ensure that their devices are following our recommendations. Again, it's just a recommendation, but we think this is a really good idea in terms of minimizing the opportunities for problems to arise. So that's heartbeat interval. And if your eyes have glassed over, your ears are all confused, you can pop a question in the Q&A period after I go through the other 2 topics here. You can, I suppose, pop it in now if you'd like. And one thing I didn't mention is there is a slight delay between the time that I talk and the time that you actually get the broadcast on YouTube, sometimes up to a minute long. So if I like people to be aware that it's not really a real-time chat. So maybe it is a good idea to put in that question now if you have any about the heartbeat interval. Happy to answer those. But we have 2 other things to get through this morning, and I want to dive into those as well. So let's take a look at batch sizes. Single batch size processing. So large batch requests may time out and slow down CBSD operation. This is something that is primarily important for domain proxies. For networks, for infrastructures that are managing a large amount of CBSDs. So we were seeing a situation where some domain proxy testing with a huge number of devices, it was just taking too long to process these requests. And so, again, we took a look at this issue and we said, well, how can we fix this without having it be a problem? How can we make this better? And the answer is we can split things up. We can split those requests up, those batch requests, those combined requests with multiple CBSD requests in that single request. We can split that up into chunks. And it turns out that works a heck of a lot better for everybody. So whereas before there was unlimited amount of CBSDs that you could request from the SAS, we've decided to make it so that you have to batch these requests together. And the maximum number of devices that we will process is 120 CBSDs per request. Now you can send as many simultaneous requests as you want. So for example, if you had 240 CBSDs, you would send 2 batch requests with 120 CBSDs at the same time, and we'll process that. But any number larger than 120 CBSDs will only the first 120 will be processed. What this change does is it prevents large batch requests from timing out. It ensures that every request will get a response from the SAS in a timely manner. So again, this is for domain proxies mostly. If you're running your entire network off of a single controller, that controller is probably sending batch requests to our SAS, and those requests now need to be 120 CBSDs per request. If you go over 120, we will process the first 120. So in other words, if you send us more than 120, we don't just say, go away. We process the first 120, and then after that, we send what's called a 106 response. The 106 response is resend. And if you're managing a domain proxy, you might want to check out our help center, which has additional information about the 106 resend response and how you can respond to that. You'll only get that 106 response if you exceed 120 CBSDs per batch request. So the best thing to do, obviously, keep your request to under 120 CBSDs per request. And as I said, send as many of those as you want. But each request has to be limited to 120. And here's another thing we did when it came to batch requests. In our test environment, the test SAS, we've limited it to 20 per batch request. And we did this because if you're actually testing with real devices, 120 is a lot of devices to configure and deal with in a test bed. So it's actually a heck of a lot easier to just have it be 20. So in the test environment, if you're doing virtual testing and staging, when your batch request exceeds 20, you'll get that same 106 error, that resend error, when you exceed 20 on the staging instance. In production, on the regular SAS, 120 devices. No problem there. But if you're doing testing in the test SAS, we're limiting that to 20 devices per batch request. Again, unlimited number of batch requests. So if you got 2,000 devices, no problem. Send us 100 batch requests with 20 devices each. It's all good. But this, again, is just for big operators and people who are managing their entire networks with domain proxies and who are batching their requests. If you're doing your SAS integration just on a CBSD by CBSD basis, this doesn't apply to you. So that is the information about probably the most technical thing I'm going to talk about today, the batch size processing. Any questions, pop them into the chat there in the YouTube channel. Oh, and another thing I forgot to say, if you're not sure why the chat channel is complaining when you're trying to type in there, don't worry about that. Here's how it works. If you've never used the chat on YouTube before, the first time you try to type something, it will come up with a little questionnaire asking you to, quote, create a channel. Don't worry about that. It's just asking you to create an identity so that YouTube can know who's posting the chat information. So just type in a name or your company name or whatever. And then once you've done that, it will let you put things into the chat. So in case that's not working, we do have a way for you to do that. last thing I want to talk about today is grant reservations. And if you're near DPAs, and many of us are, if you're operating near the coast or near a DPA, this is something that you may have become aware of. The concept of CPAS and the concept of IAP pending and those responses that you get because of the complications with DPAs. And you know very well that being on a DPA move list means that if that DPA is activated due to whatever testing activity or Navy aircraft carrier or whatever activates that happens to activate that DPA, that means you have to change frequencies, and that's a pain. Even more painful is if you are the first time you register your device, you're put on all of the move lists that are that you're in the neighborhood of. So if you're, even, I don't know how many, depends on the number of miles, varies, but a couple hundred miles sometimes from a DPA, you still get put on the move list on day one. And that's because of something called CPAS. So again, before we get into the grant reservations, let me just make sure that we're all on the same page. I don't know who's on board here, and I want to make sure we're all aware of what's going on here. So let's talk briefly about CPAS, and then I'll tell you about this new feature. So grants that are within each DPA has a neighborhood around it. And that neighborhood varies in the amount of space, but essentially the neighborhood is that area around the DPA where if you're inside that area, on the first day of operation, or of a grant, sorry, not of operation, it's the first time you submit a grant, if you're in that neighborhood, you get put on the DPA's move list. In other words, you're linked to that your device is linked to that DPA, and if it channel gets suspended on that DPA, you have to your CBSD has to deal with it. It's going to have to move, and that's on day one. What happens every night is the SAS recomputes interference. Actually, all SAS operators talk to each other and recompute the actual interference that is going to be caused by all of the devices in total. What happens then is that your CBSD is then removed from many of the move lists because the CBSD is no longer going to impact. We know that CBSD is not going to impact the DPA. So in other words, if you're far enough away, once CPAS has happened in the middle of the night, your grant is taken off of certain DPA move lists. It's optimized. It is basically given disconnected from any DPAs that don't matter at all to it. And we won't know that, and we don't know that until CPAS happens. So until CPAS happens, a new grant is on every move list that it needs to be on. After CPAS, it gets taken off any move lists that we know it doesn't need to be on. But we have to do that in the middle of the night with all the other SASs because we don't know how many new devices are out there. That's why this thing called CPAS happens every night. So what happens is the CBSDs are going to be suspended less once the CBSD's grant goes through CPAS. So a day 2 grant is less susceptible or less at risk to suspension because it's been taken off any move lists that don't matter. And what that means is a day 2 grant is better than a day 1 grant because it's gone through CPAS. We know what the interference is going to be for it. So previously, up until, well, I guess today, because we're just announcing this, if a device lost its grant, it had to go back to day 1. So if you had a grant You went through CPAS in the middle of the night, and the CBSD continues to operate on day 2. It's got this great optimized move lists, which is just on 1 DPA instead of 4 of them, and it's not very much of a risk of suspension. Maybe it's lost all of its move lists because we determined during CPAS that this grant is not pertaining to any DPAs at all. Okay, great. But that same device, if it loses that grant up until today, if it loses that grant, then it would have had to start fresh. It would have been back to day 1, and it would have had to go back on the move lists, which is frustrating for devices near the coast because those DPAs do activate, particularly in places like Norfolk or up near Seattle, where you've got aircraft carriers. So it's better off to have a day 2 grant than a day 1 grant, because you're only going to be on a day 2 grant. You're only going to be connected to the DPAs that your CBSD really has to be connected to. So here's what we did. This is the cool part. We've introduced grant reservations. And grant reservations reduce the risk of suspension when requesting a similar grant on the same day. So with the grant reservation feature, the CBSD can effectively reclaim a previous grant with the same post-CPAS optimized move lists. Whoa, that's a lot. Okay, hang on. With that grant reservation feature, the CBSD can effectively reclaim the same grant that it may have lost, that same day 2 grant that has gone through CPAS, or at least the privileges thereof. So what this does is making it more simple. It allows devices to effectively hold on to their grant, even if they lose it, even if it's relinquished. So how does this work? Let's go through these steps one by one. First of all, we have a situation where your CBSD has a grant. It's more than 1 day old. It's been there for who knows how many weeks. That means it's gone through CPAS. It's optimized to only be on the move list for the DPAs it really needs to be on. And then that CBSD, for whatever reason, then relinquishes that grant. Okay, fine. Now with grant reservations, there's nothing you have to do. There's no additional action necessary on your part, because what will happen is if, prior to the next CPAS, that same CBSD requests a new grant with the same frequency range and a equal or lower EIRP. So essentially, it relinquished the grant and it wants a grant with the same or lower EIRP and that same frequency range again. So it's essentially asking for the grant back. What happens now with grant reservations on Google SAS, the new grant will be issued to that CBSD and it will be in the same move list as the relinquished grant. So it will get its day 2 optimized DPA move lists without having to wait for CPAS. And we know that because it's on the same frequency range and it's got equal or lower EIRP. So we are holding on to the move lists for you, that grant privileges. And if your device re-requests the same privileges, we give it to you without having to go through CPAS. And again, if you're operating near the coast, this is a great thing. So I've got Martin Jensen in the chat asking a question. Martin, hold on to those questions for just a second. I want to go through the second slide of this grant reservations concept in case it clears things up a little more. So here are the limitations on effectively reclaiming a grant. The reclaimed grant has the same EIRP restrictions. So the grant cannot be for more power. If you ask for more power, we'll need you to go through CPAS. Or I should say, the CBRS infrastructure requires you to go through CPAS. Also, if the CBSD deregisters, all reservations become unrecoverable. Okay, this is an important point. If you want to recover the grant and you take advantage of grant reservations, don't deregister the CBSD, because at that point we delete the information pertaining to those grants. They become unrecoverable. So if the CBSD just relinquishes that grant or loses the grant for whatever reason, the heartbeats are lost or whatever, it can then just re-request it. But don't power cycle or don't do anything that would make the CBSD re-register with us, because that will effectively erase those grants. Point number 3, CBSDs cannot claim reservations from grant relinquished on previous days. In other words, it has to be since the most recent CPAS. So a reclamation of a grant, getting those same privileges back, it has to happen before CPAS occurs. You have to do it on the previous day. Once CPAS runs, we also, all previous reservations that are unclaimed become unrecoverable. So again, you have to do it within the same day, because once CPAS kicks off in the middle of the night, all the grant reservations go away. Lastly, claiming a reservation only copies the move list membership for the previous grant. It does not offer a shortcut to past IAP pending. In other words, we're copying the move list membership from the previous grant. You're not actually reclaiming that same grant. But what we're doing is we know that grant doesn't have any problems because it's gone through CPAS, and we're just giving those privileges back to you. So that's how grant reservations work. And this is going to be a big benefit to people operating near the coast, who previously, when they lost their grants, were back to day one and put on a bunch of move lists. Now you can ask for that same grant back, and you'll only be put on the move list that you were on previously. Now, the question is from Martin. Good morning, Martin from California. I'm in California, don't know where you are, but good morning. I'm going to say good afternoon or good evening wherever you are. I guess it's not evening yet in Israel, unless you're in Europe. Martin asks, it will only get its old grant back after the aircraft carrier is gone. So, Martin, we're talking about two different things here. If an aircraft carrier is present, that activates the DPA. And if your CBSD is on the move list, if it's connected to the move list of that DPA, then the aircraft carrier will have an impact on your operation. What I'm explaining is that the number of move lists that your CBSD is connected to is more the first time it asks for that grant. Once the grant goes through CPAS, then that same grant gets taken off of DPA move lists, which means it's not connected to as many DPAs. So on day one, your CBSD may be impacted by an aircraft carrier that's on a move list that's pretty far away. After CPAS on day two, once the SAS has determined that your CBSD is far enough away to not have any impact to that aircraft carrier, then on day two, you actually won't get taken off of that. You won't be impacted at all by that aircraft carrier. So what I'm talking about here for grant reservations has nothing to do with the aircraft carrier itself. It has to do with the grant and whether or not that grant is connected to certain DPAs. And on day two, once that grant is not connected to DPAs, certain DPAs, then you have more flexibility. And the grant reservation process allows you to reclaim that day two privilege, that better optimized grant, without having to wait for CPAS again. So your device can relinquish a grant, get that same grant on the same channel for the same amount of power, and you don't have to be put on all the additional move lists that you would have otherwise been on day one. Martin's second question is, And is any changes or support required for this feature in the eNode Bs? No. And that's the other cool part about this. This is all happening behind the scenes. So you don't have to do anything. The only thing that's kind of important is the second bullet point here on this slide. If the CBSD deregisters, all reservations become unrecoverable. So the key thing to do is to avoid deregistering your device if at all possible. Because once it deregisters, we erase those grants. So we can't qualify your device, your CBSD, to re-request those grants. And I guess that's really the only thing to keep in mind. Other than that, without having to do anything, you will all benefit if you're on a DPA move list. Your device will benefit from this new feature, grant reservations, because when it goes and asks for that same grant again, you'll get put on the optimized list of DPAs. You'll only get the move list that you really have to be on, or that you really were on. Let's say. Of course, that could change after every day during CPAS, but essentially, the difference on day one, between day one and day two, there is a significant difference in terms of the number of move lists that you're put on. So this will hopefully allow devices to operate more freely, even if they have to re-request their grants. Good questions, Martin. Thank you very much. A reminder about our Help Center. We have made multiple updates of our Help Center to explain these features. The grant reservations feature will be coming soon. I think that's still going through proofreading, but that will be up very shortly into the Help Center as well, which will all of these Help Center articles. If you haven't been, go check it out. It's really great. All you have to do is just do a Google search for Google CBRS Help or Google SAS Help, and it will pop up as the first should pop up as your first result, and then you can search and go through all of our Help Center articles. And a shout out to our Help Center team. Those writers do a great job putting these articles together and online for us, and there's really a huge amount of information there. So a shout out to those folks who are really helping us with the documentation side of things for Google SAS. So thank you.